You're watching the Isaiah Factor Uncensored.
And welcome back to the second half of the Factor Uncensored for this special edition on MLK Day. There's no secret that Dr. Martin Luther King was a man who selflessly gave back for the betterment of not just black people, but all people. But there is a side of him that a lot of people didn't see or simply don't know about. Dr. King was a badass. Dr. Vita Robinson from the University of Houston downtown reveals the real MLK.
For those who feel like they know who Dr. King is, the impression that many of us in the public may have is not quite accurate, is it?
No, sir. The Martin Luther King that we are often taught in our preparatory education and in many of our public spaces is a very sanitized version of King. That King serves the purpose of nullifying many of the radical aspects of his teaching and the work that he did as a community organizer. And so we must always recognize that King, of course, was an extremist in a lot of his from his contemporary perspective, that the things that he was fighting for are the things that we are still fighting for today.
Just his mere existence and what he did during the civil rights movement shows that he was an extremist. He wasn't willing to just sit back and take what the government had, what society had in place for blacks, for minorities around this country. He pushed against the machine.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. In one of his famous, the letter from Birmingham jail, King would say it this way. He says, "We know that through the painful experience that freedom is never, never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." So for King, in order for us to bring about the real emancipation of African Americans, of poor people, of colonized people throughout the world, we had to push on the system itself, make the structure itself vibrate with the kind of creative tension that he believed would force us to resolve our contradictory American ideals. And so he ended up being, in many eyes, of course, at that time, an extremist. As a matter of fact, 63% of Americans believed that Martin Luther King was bad for the country in 1966. There
Wow.
more
that
Americans
is
were
an incredible number. And you think about it today, it's like, we love Dr. King, but so many people were against him back then.
That's right. That's right. They, at least at that moment in time, as he was merging his radical his search for racial justice and merging it with his Poor People's Campaign, as well as his recognition and opposition of the Vietnam War, Americans had seen enough. He was the Derek Bell of his time, right? Mm-hmm. That here he is, he's the Black Lives Matter. He's talking about making the structure give way to a new America. And that scared us as a nation.
And he didn't run away from the labels. In fact, he embraced being called essentially a troublemaker, those who are pushing against the machine, those who are trying to shake things up. He embraced those titles and descriptions. Yes,
sir. Yes, he did. Many times he would refer to himself as a democratic socialist, or he would take on of course, he was the drum major for justice, but he was also an activist in the truest sense of the term.
Now, when we talk about Dr. King and we think about Malcolm X, we think about two different people, two different approaches. Did he realize there was back then that there was two very different approaches between them?
Yes, I think King recognized for Martin Luther King, he fundamentally differed from Malcolm X in so much as he was unwilling to engage in the kind of brutal barbarity, the kind of open violence that ended up being a hallmark of our American experiment. That in this land of the free, in the home of the brave, we had systematically utilized violence as a weapon of containing marginalized people, primarily Black people. And so for Malcolm X was more than willing to take up arms. He, for him, he was either the ballot or the bullet. And he believed that Martin believed in the ballot, in a game that was already set and had already chosen its winners. And by the rules that it had established, it would never truly give African Americans the emancipatory or the liberation that they were seeking. But for Martin Luther King, he believed that we must maintain the integrity of being a nonviolent people, because the stereotypes that white supremacy was utilizing only justified that violence would lead to other violence, and we, of course, would end up in a bloody war.